Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Dark Frontier, which is episodes 15 and 16 of Season 5 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This video was requested by Paul Z. So, Dark Frontier was the 2-hour special, which begins with Voyager conducting raids on the Borg in order to get supplies. Most specifically, they are looking for transwarp coils so that they can get home faster. They find a Borg sphere that has been damaged and is limping home, and they plan a heist to try to beam in and steal the sphere's transwarp coil. While preparing for the mission, 7 of 9 receives transmissions from the Borg Queen telling her she needs to return to the Borg, otherwise they'll destroy Voyager. So, during the mission to steal the transwarp coil, which is a success, 7 stays behind so that Voyager will be spared. 7 of 9 is then brought into the presence of the Borg Queen, who says it was her plan all along to place 7 with Voyager so that she could gain knowledge of the humans in order to assimilate them, and she refuses to turn 7 back into a drone, calling her unique. Meanwhile, Janeway strives to get 7 of 9 back and eventually comes up with a plan using stealth technology from her parents' research, and she sneaks in and holds the Borg Queen at a stalemate by threatening to kill them all unless she lets them go, which she does. Then 7 and Janeway safely return back to Voyager. So, the reason Paul Z requested this episode was because he wanted to know why I hated this episode so much. This episode is generally looked at very positively by the fan base and has been known to pop up on some Voyager top 10 lists from time to time. However, when I did my top 10 Borg episodes video, I named this episode the second worst Borg episode ever. So, let me get into this first. What is my problem with this episode? And that can be summed up in one sentence. Because it is completely inconsistent with everything that came before it, and it tries to rewrite history. To me, consistency is important, and television shows, even though those aren't necessarily serialized and are more episodic in nature, are still basically telling one story. The fact that this story is told over a long period of time as opposed to a singular movie or a singular book doesn't give it the excuse to completely change everything that came before it and act like something else actually didn't happen when it did. For example, if you were reading a book in Chapter 2 this character died, and then later in Chapter 11 the same character is alive with no explanation and they acted like he never died in the first place, what would you call that? The only real answer is bad writing. And it's completely ridiculous and unacceptable in my eyes to call someone who is pointing out these obvious errors as nerdy or geeky or nitpicky because they noticed something from an episode that aired several years ago. I'm sorry, but that is bullshit. If in, say, George R. R. Martin's next book in the Song of Ice and Fire series, The Winds of Winter, if he wrote that Ned Stark was alive and tried to pretend like he never really died in the first place, what would you call that? Bad writing. People would admit this is bad writing, and no one would be criticized for pointing out that this is an obvious, huge plot hole, and it's an indication of bad writing. The same thing goddamn holds true for fucking TV shows as well. Now, there is a difference between coming up with a lame excuse for this inconsistency or simply ignoring it and pretends it doesn't exist. Like, soap operas are infamous for doing this with excuses all the time, as when they kill off a character and then their ratings dip because the fans like that character too much, they come up with some lame excuse to bring that character back to life and be like, oh, I never died. What actually happened was my long lost identical twin, that he was the one you saw got thrown under a plane and then eaten by sharks and then blown up by dynamite. That was him, not me. However, the other trick is just to pretend the inconsistency didn't exist and hope no one will notice, and that's what this episode does in spades. Bades. So, in this episode, 7 of 9 studies the journal of her parents who studied the Borg when she was a little girl. Janeway said they retrieved these logs from the USS Raven, and Neelix brought in a whole box full of these logs for 7 to study. We also see flashbacks to when 7 was a little girl and how her parents took her along as they studied the Borg, followed them all the way to the Delta Quadrant. Okay, so that quick little summary right there is littered with blatant inconsistencies. It's just ridiculous. So let me attempt to unpack them for you. First of all, in the episode The Raven, where they discovered the ship 7 was assimilated from as a little girl, which was an amazing episode by the way, the ship was being attacked by space aliens it was their space that the planet belonged in, and they were really pissed off that Voyager was in their space without permission. So Tuvok and 7 barely escaped with their lives before the ship fell off a cliff and was destroyed. And not to mention, the ship wasn't even functional, so they definitely did not have time to download any frickin' logs. Certainly not an entire box full, which Neelix specifically said in this episode that it took him all day to download these logs. Secondly, it was never established that her parents were studying the Borg. They never said that they weren't either, but that aspect was a complete construct of this episode, and 7 and Janeway were behaving like it was an already known fact. Thirdly, 7 of 9's parents are portrayed in the flashbacks in The Raven were a hell of a lot older than they are in this episode. But maybe for some reason you think all these inconsistencies are excusable because it's just from one episode. Well then, let's go ahead and move on to the whopper of this episode, which isn't just inconsistent with one episode, but all of established lore on the Borg in the Star Trek universe. In the flashbacks, we see the Hansons, they know all about the Borg. They even mention that Starfleet knows all about the Borg. And 7 of 9 appears to be, at present times, to be in, let's say, her late 20s. At her youngest, let's say she's 26 through 29, and has a little girl. In these flashbacks, she appears to be between the ages of 6 and 9 years old. So it's safe to say these flashbacks are occurring roughly 20 years prior to this episode. Whereas the Borg were first introduced in The Next Generation in the episode Q Who, which took place approximately 10 years before this episode. Now, unless they're trying to change the timeline and say this episode is taking place more than 20 years after Q Who, which would create all sorts of continuity problems in its own, then that means these flashbacks take place way before Q Who, so no one in the Federation nor Starfleet should have any idea who the fuck the Borg are. Now, I did have a commenter once bring it up that in the film First Contact and the subsequent Enterprise episode Regeneration, the timeline was altered so that the Federation were aware of the Borg as far back as the Enterprise times, and that's why 7's parents knew of the Borg. First off, if I were to accept this as true, which I don't, but if I were, then that would be filed under the lame excuse department, just like the soap opera example I gave. But, as the same commenter even pointed out, this episode was made before the Enterprise episode, and in the film First Contact there was no indication any lasting evidence that the Borg existed ever remained. But if you do consider the Enterprise episode, I'm not sure they even learned the name of the species, the Borg, or they certainly didn't know that they flew around in cube-shaped ships. And all this information 7's parents had. Besides, I'm sure that the Enterprise episode and First Contact were never meant to erase the events of Q-Who, but coexist beside it. So I'm sorry, any way you slice it, these flashback scenes are some ridiculous bullshit right here, and they spit directly in the face of all Star Trek lore that came before it. And no, it's not a minor mick-pick. It's a massive spaceship-sized plot hole, a blatant example of sloppy, lazy, horrible writing, plain and fucking simple. To say otherwise reeks of lame excuses. And if you think I'm done pointing out the inconsistencies of this episode, oh, just you wait. I haven't even gotten to the best part yet. So, once Seven is on the Borg ship with the Borg Queen, she tells Seven that she placed 7 of 9 on Voyager so that she could learn about the humans, and Seven could return to her with the information so that she could use it to create a bioweapon to assimilate Earth slowly through nanotechnology. I'm sorry, but that's just fucking stupid. I don't even know where to begin with this bullshit. First off, I'm not buying for a single goddamn second that the Borg Queen planted 7 of 9 on Voyager. To suggest this insults my intelligence. Watch the events that took place in the episode Scorpion. The Borg didn't want an alliance with Janeway. She had to force it. And the Borg, and 7 of 9 in particular, constantly and consistently tried to assimilate Voyager. To suggest that she was planted there on purpose is some of the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Secondly, what possible advantage could the Borg Queen gain from having 7 of 9 on Voyager all this time? The Borg already seemed all knowledgeable of humans. After all, they already assimilated Captain Picard and gained all of his knowledge, so what could they learn from her that they haven't already learned from him? And I certainly don't see how she would be helpful in creating a bioweapon. They seem to already have all that under control. And also, how come they never used said bioweapon in the future? Nothing Janeway or Seven did in this episode would prevent the possibility of them using it on Earth in the future. Also, I reject this notion of the Borg Queen saying that Seven is unique and special, and how she wouldn't turn her into a drone. That just seemed like plot convenience bullshit to me. Also, as I mentioned in other videos before, the notion that the Borg are so desperate to assimilate Earth and have to resort to elaborate plans like time travel or planting 7 of 9 on Voyager is beyond absurd, as all they have to do is send a fleet to Earth rather than just one fucking ship, and bam, Earth is yours, problem solved. No need for time travel or to plant a random drone on a Federation starship, or fancy bioweapons for that matter. She even said in this episode, a direct assault always fails. And that's when I was screaming at my TV, that's because you only send one ship, dumbass! I mean, seriously. Also, another inconsistency I noticed is in this episode, the Borg Queen says to 7 of 9, you are the only Borg drone to experience sense of individuality, or what it is to be human, which is not true. What about Hugh and the whole fucking ship of Borg drones that he was on that became individuals? But anyway, again, that's just one episode. So now, it's not just that this episode has inconsistencies. I mean, the stuff with the Raven, for example, on its own, that's easily forgivable. For example, the Deep Space Nine two-parter past tense uses some of the worst time travel logic I've ever seen, and although that does really annoy me, the rest of the episode is so good I'm able to overlook that, and I even put it on my top 10 Deep Space Nine episode list. But the thing with Dark Frontier, well, it's two things, actually. First, these inconsistencies are far too numerous and far too vast to ignore. Secondly, the rest of the episode isn't very good either. I mentioned it in a previous video that Voyager ended up doing for the Borg what Jar Jar Binks did for the Star Wars universe, and that is turning them into a silly, cartoonish villain. And I think that began right here with this episode. Before this episode, the Borg on Voyager were done quite well. The third season episode, Unity, was really interesting. The two-part cliffhanger Scorpion was amazing, and having Seven of Nine in the fourth season and her encounters with the Borg were always very interesting and well done. And earlier in the fifth season, they had an episode called Drone, which is my favorite Borg episode of all time and one of my favorite Voyager episodes. But beginning with this episode, the Borg on Voyager became a ridiculous, cartoonish villain that seemed more silly than menacing, and a lot of this had to do with what I just mentioned about the Borg's plot making no sense, and they came off as a James Bond type villain, coming up with these elaborate, overly complicated contraptions to kill Bond instead of just shooting him in the frickin' head. But just other ways they behaved just came off as silly. Like the way the Borg Queen always says Janeway every time that she sees her. It's like, it's like in a cartoon when it'd be like, oh, you rascally kids, not you again. Something about it just seems really Scooby-Doo-ish to me. And this only gets worse every time the Borg came back on Voyager, up until the series finale Endgame, which was laughably Ed Wood type bad. Also, getting back to Janeway's plan to steal technology from the Borg to help them get home, how is this okay for a Starfleet vessel to behave like this way? I mean, because the Borg are a bunch of meanies excuse, does that really excuse the fact that Voyager crew are now acting like a bunch of space pirates, just attacking defenseless, damaged ships to steal their technology so they can get home quicker? How does this make it any better from those assholes they encountered in the episode The Void, who would attack ships, defenseless ships, and steal their shit in order to survive? I mean, Janeway got up all on her high horse to those people, but with this episode, she's doing the exact same thing. It's like, well, it's just the Borg, fuck them, they suck anyway, who cares? Come on now, Janeway, but that is racist. Borg are people too. Anyway, so my rating for Dark Frontier out of 10 is a 2, extremely poor. I do get what this episode was trying to accomplish and why some people like it. It was gritty and suspenseful and explored just how connected Seven has become to the Voyager crew. And some of those scenes, like the one where the Borg was assimilating those race of people and Seven had to stand helplessly by and watch it happen, was chilling. But when the entire episode is littered with plot holes and cartoonish cliches, and the main plot of the episode that the Borg planted Seven with Voyager and thinks she's special is beyond ridiculous, it ruins any credibility this episode has. So that's it for my review of Dark Frontier. If there's an episode from any of the 5 Star Trek series you would like me to review, just leave a comment below with the episode you'd like me to review, and I'll endeavor to do so, but please, 1 episode request per person. But if you'd like to request an Enterprise episode, the first person who does that gets that request free, meaning that won't count towards your 1 request. And make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.